So before we begin building the applications for this course, let's try out a quick practice round that introduces you to the big ideas in Rails of what an application looks like in an editor and essentially the workflow. So right now I'm in the terminal and I'm in the desktop directory. So you can actually type in pwd to see where you are, or you can list what folders are available in the current directory. I'm going to move into the Ruby on Rails folder and begin working on our practice app. Our practice app is going to be, let's say, a blog application. And this blog application will have a few very important components. It will have users, it will have posts, and it will have comments. So these are the three objects of the application. So post, user, and comment will be the three models that we'll work on. Now, let's actually start our application. Let's create a Rails application from scratch. So what you do here is type in Rails new and the name of the application you have in mind. So in my case, I'll just say blog. And keep in mind that blog is being created in the ROR directory. These are essentially all the files that come in when you run the command. You get all the files that I'll explain to you in greater detail, your README files, your gem files, which is where all the gems will be stored, all your style sheets, essentially all these other folders that we'll go into detail in just a moment. But right after it's created, it also runs bundle install. This is how it fetches all the gems from rubygems.org. And these are all the gems that we'll be working with, or we'll see at least, and there are 53 gems. Also, you actually want to check at this point what version of Ruby you have and what version of Rails. So let's say Ruby V, for the version of Ruby I have, is 2.2.1. Let's say this is not the version you have. You would say RVM and then use Ruby-2.2.1, and then it makes sure that's what you have. Or you could do, let's also check the Rails actually. Rails version, I have 4.2.5, I believe. Yep, that is what I have. And you can also, to make sure that this is what you have, you can go gem update Rails NORI doc, and this makes sure that you have the latest version. If it's not, then you want to update. You also want to go through the installrails.com website and see if it's properly installed on your machine. So in my case, everything is up to date. So at this point, I've already created my application. If you go to ls, you'll see that blog was created over here. What I would need to do now is cd into blog and then run the server. So it's Rails server. So this runs the application for us on our local machine. And Rails comes with WebBrick, which is where we'll be working and building our application before we send it up for production on some cloud service like Heroku, for example. So let's actually jump to a different tab and let's let the server run on this tab. Here, let's again, you want to cd into blog or change directory. At this point, we want to type in open, and we can actually move back in, and it was here, move blog into our Sublime Text. And this is the editor that is preferred for this course. You can use any editor, of course. But let me explain what these different folders are. These are all the things that come out when you launch a Rails application. This is why it's so popular, that there's just so much functionality that's pre-built into it. So app folder is where we'll spend most of our time. We have our assets, which will be our images, our style sheets, and JavaScript, of course. And then this is the controllers, which is also a significant part of the MVC framework. There will be helpers, which is where our modules will exist. We won't be working on modules for our course. Mailers to send email from your application. Models, which is the other component of the MVC. And views as well, which is the other component of the MVC. The bin directory is the app executables or Ruby scripts. So this would be like bundle, Rails, rake, which we'll be using quite a bit in the terminal, that is. And then there's the config. Rails is all about convention over configuration. So for the most part, there's very little configuration that we must do. Environments, there are three types of environments. There's the production, test, and development that we'll work on. Database YAML is different types of databases. This is where we set it up. The database that comes as the default is SQLite, as you can see here. But for especially production, we will want to use something more sophisticated like MySQL or Postgres, especially if you want to launch it to Heroku, which will be the a preferred cloud service. Routes is something that will be very important for our application. We'll spend quite a bit of time here. This is essentially how our application manages incoming web requests. And database, or DB, is essentially all our migration files will be kept here as we're building our application. And this is how we modify the tables in the database. We don't see it right now, but there's a schema, a schema.rb. That's essentially a snapshot of our database at any point. I want to remind you to not mess with it in any way, because the way we want to modify our database is by using migrations instead of directly through schema.rb. Seed.rb is actually how you get preloaded data to work with in our application. We won't be using that a lot, or at all actually. And then the lib folder is where the reusable code libraries are. So you have tasks and assets. We won't be using that either. There's log directory. This is where the application log files are, especially used for debugging. So there are log files for development, production, and testing. The public directory is for error messages. So say the great thing about the public directory is that even if your application crashes, these pages work. So these error messages work. So if I were to take you to Google Chrome, and this is the error message for Evernote. It actually, if the application were to fail, this would still render for us. So the next one after public is the test directory. Testing is in Rails is, let's say, test-driven development, or TDD. This is where we write tests to first make sure that the app is working as it should. So you write the test, and then the code that makes it pass. That's an interesting way of doing testing in Rails. And our next one is our temp directory. This is where temporary files are, so your cache, your sessions, and PIDs. The vendor directory is assets that are needed by third-party gems, but we won't be using this because all the gems are managed by bundle. So our next major file here is the gem file. We'll be working with the gem file quite a bit. This is where we essentially get prepackaged code from rubygems.org to add enormous value to our apps. We'll be using this quite a bit and working with it. And our rake file here at the bottom as well this is where we locate and load tasks that can be run from the command line. And our README file is essentially where we write a description of what the application does, so someone else who comes to it can understand it. Usually this is done for other developers who want to interact with their application.